Welcome to Behind the Scenes, where I will be showcasing the making of an animated music video, Thistle mini AMV, My Heartbeat Running Away. I'm very excited to get onto this behind the scenes, since creating an animated music video is a bit different than creating a part for multi-animator project. While the youth nowadays is growing up watching collaborated maps as their animation content, I grew up watching AMVs. AMVs are what the name suggests, an animated music video that's created by an individual. Sometimes some AMVs can be collabs, but more often they are individual projects with some helpers in the background. While the majority of multi-animator projects are announced publicly, animated music videos tend to be projects that the creators keep as a secret as far into the process as possible. There are exceptions, of course, but in general, as AMVs tend to be a lot more work than a 7-second part, the creators prefer not to reveal the project too early, commonly because of fear of public pressure. What one would consider as an AMV then? Pretty much anything. Personally, I prefer to think that the minimum length of an AMV is 15 seconds, pushing towards 30 seconds. The average length of an AMV nowadays can go from over 1 minute up to a length of a full song. Back in 2014, I created a mini AMV of my character Thistle when he was still a Warrior Cats fan character called Thistle. This AMV was, and still is, very near and dear to my heart. A few years after I had finished the original AMV, I began to play around with the idea of redoing the AMV and see my growth as an animator. It was more of a silly thought at first. However, the more I let the idea sit and stew inside my head, I began to feel more and more confident about the idea of actually doing it. This would normally be a point where I would have done a rough storyboard on paper, or at least written down a script, since we are talking about the longer animation project than a map part. Instead, I used the original animation as my guide and pre-existing visual script for the project. Since I had such easy access to a pre-existing storyboard, I just needed to sketch out the keyframes, breakdowns, and in-betweens. I didn't change much compared to the original mini AMV, except for the first shot, the angle of a shot where Fern bursts into tears, and the final shot. What is this animated music video about exactly? This AMV focuses on the relationship between Thistle and Fern. They have a very strong bond as friends and show that they like each other from time to time. However, as Fern's former mate died unexpectedly seasons prior, she has a hard time moving on with her life. In the AMV, Thistle is trying to pursue Fern, attempting to tell her that despite her grief of her former mate, she should have the strength in her to move on and open up her eyes to what's right in front of her. That's the basics of it, and I let the AMV show the rest. These characters are nearly a decade old, and are originally Warrior Cats fan characters, as I mentioned earlier. Thistle was Thistlepelt, and Fern was Fernleaf. So if I accidentally call Thistle Thistlepelt, or Fern Fernleaf, know that I still talk about the same character. Thistle and Fern are from my story called Path of Stars, which was originally going to be a fan comic based on the world of Warrior Cats with its own unique clans and characters. I never ended up finishing the comic, but its remains can still be read on my DeviantArt if you're curious to see the roots of the story. I dropped the comic because I moved on to make more original comics and projects. While the story is a decade old, it has still had a place in my heart to a point where I was dying to actually make it. whether it was original or not. I brought up my frustration to one of my friends from uni, and she pointed out that what is exactly stopping me from turning Path of Stars into its own original story. I genuinely don't know why I needed to hear this from a third party, but sincerely, thank you, Tina. I am forever thankful for your gentle slap to reality and for giving me the courage to return back to this old and dear project of mine. Since then, I have begun to revamp Path of Stars into its own original world. And while it's far from finished, I am really happy with how far with the development I have come. I am well aware that Path of Stars will never shake off perfectly its warrior cat's roots. However, I am content and aware of this fact, and I will gladly let some Easter eggs sneak into the comic when the story is up to that stage. What Path of Stars is about? Path of Stars is about 4 colonies/clans of cats that live within their own land and unique environments. Each of the colonies has a special sense that sets them apart from one another. Awakening the sixth sense is a generations-long, well-guarded secret. The story settles around the main characters, Fern's home colony. Thistle is one of the side characters. Path of Stars is going to be a story of discovering oneself, living within the pressure and expectations set by the community around you, spiced up with a threat coming from beyond anyone's grasp. It's going to be an adventure fantasy comic with a hint of drama. When sketching out this video AMV, I was debating whether I should keep Fern's and Thistle's original designs for this project, or whether I should refresh and update the designs while I was at it. I decided to go forward with the idea of updating their designs, but keeping the key elements that made the characters what they have always been. I guess you could say that not only did I do this mini AMV to see how far I've come as an animator, but also as a character designer. Here are the original designs of the two, dating all the way back to 2011. It's kind of weird to look at my old style now, but instead of feeling cringe, I actually feel very proud of myself. While I understand why some may cringe at their old art and artworks, I personally like to look at my old art from an aspect of how much I have grown since. Art is a journey, and while some take longer than others, the journey is never going to be perfect. There will be mistakes done on the way, and that's part of the process. While you may not like the way you did anatomy or colors 5 years prior, doesn't that prove that you have managed to improve in those areas? Why would you scold your past self if you needed that phase in your life to reach the point you are at today? Isn't that worth celebrating rather than belittling your efforts? Just a little food of thought for you all. So, because I still highly enjoy the designs of both characters, I decided to keep the idea behind the markings for both of them and focus on the physical characteristics. Fern went through only color alternations for her design, since I wanted to keep her characteristics very close to my regular way of drawing fluffy cats. Round, soft, fluffy. You get the idea if you have been around my channel for a longer time. The colors Fern used to have. Well, I guess that using highly saturated colors is something that nearly every character designer goes through at some point in their lives. While it isn't a bad thing, I can admit that in Fern's case, she was probably a bit too saturated. The yellows in her old design were very bright and noticeable, while the darker brown splotches nearly blend together with black markings, which may be jarring to look at. I changed the color palette towards warmer hues of earthy gingers and browns. I wanted her color palette to show her internal flame, while her eyes remained cool, bringing in some healthy contrast. The way I managed to separate the three colors that appear in her fern-like splotches makes me feel ecstatic, since this is what I originally wanted from her design. Three distinct yet cooperative colors that don't cancel each one out. In Thistle's case, I wanted to bring in more flavor to his grays. I tinted his very grayscale design towards yellow and orange, giving him a warmer hue as well. His eyes remain the most saturated part of his design because of his bright and optimistic personality. For physical characteristics, I wanted to make Thistle tall and more spiky, kind of like how Thistle plants are in general. Not only did I want to make Thistle taller than Fern, but I also wanted to give him longer ears than normal. The length of his ears helps to portray his personality even further than just simple eye color. He got a couple of spiky tufts of fur, namely at the top of his cheeks, on top of his head, at his elbows, butt, and at the beginning of his tail. Because of the spiky addition to his design, I wanted to link his stripes to some of the tufts. That way, when coloring his frames, I had clear guides where the stripe would start and where it would end. I have explained my cleanup process in depth for the past 3 behind the scenes, so I will keep it very short here. Because I didn't include the physical characteristics to the sketch itself, namely Thistle's tufts, I had to add them during the cleanup phase. It wasn't very difficult, thankfully. Even though I would have preferred to have them sketched out originally, I am glad that I bothered to add them later, because they bring in so much character to the characters. If you are new here, or haven't picked it up yet, I love coloring and adding color to whatever I'm doing. From drawings, to comics, to animations. Coloring is literally what feeds my soul and gets me excited every time I finish coloring a frame or an animation sequence. Because of this, I want to give extra attention to my coloring process for this AMV in this behind the scenes, since not only do I love coloring, the characters I am animating here are very complex when thinking about animated characters. Would I recommend people making their character designs unnecessarily complex? No, especially if you are designing characters for multi-animator projects. Daniel Flowers made a good video talking about this specific topic, so I'll link his video to the iCard above. However, even though it is generally encouraged to avoid animating complex and highly detailed designs because of issues that may come with it, I personally enjoy it. While I am aware that the highly detailed character doesn't bring anything extra to the table in terms of 2D animation, and can be considered expensive to produce in a professional setting, I love doing characters that have more complicated patterns. I'm aware that they may be time-consuming to color in animation, but in the end, it's my time and I want to represent my characters in a way that's most authentic to them. So, the question I get asked a lot: how do I avoid my markings going through space or wiggling uncontrollably all around? The easiest way to avoid the said design mishaps from happening is to start your coloring from keyframes. With this mini AMV, I first colored the keyframes from the shot I wanted to color. From the keyframes, I began to move into the middle frame that was equally in between the two keyframes. From there, I repeated the process over and over again, coloring the frames between the in-betweens and keyframes, etc. In other words, I colored the frames furthest apart from one another, and then I began to close in the distance. After coloring the keyframes, the stage may appear very confusing, because there are a lot of lines going on all over the place when using the onion skin. However, if you have the design reference nearby, you can use that as a helping hand. When you color plenty of complex characters many times over and over again, you will start to pick up and learn to recognize all the frames apart from one another. As I mentioned earlier about making Thistle's stripes connect with his tufts, those were some of the key points I used to help his stripes remain consistent. I didn't shade this mini AMV because I wanted to keep everything visually as close to the original AMV as possible. Because I hadn't shaded that one, I didn't shade this redo either. The only exception to this was Fern on the first shot, where I added a purplish blue mask layer on top of her in order to make her blend better with her nightly surroundings. As the coloring was done, alongside with the eyes and eye highlights, I moved to the backgrounds. The majority of backgrounds are simple gradients, because the scene of this AMV takes place in more of a dreamy landscape. It isn't any specific scene from Path of Stars. You could see it as an artistic music video kind of dreamy space, where the characters are the primary interest. That's why the background is more simple, because I want the focus to remain on the characters, instead of giving an eye a chance to dart away from them. But the first shot, on the other hand, was a completely different story. I spent 2 days working solely on that one background. The first day I spent on sketching, and the second lining and coloring it. Unlike the rest of the AMV, the first shot takes place at one of the borders between Fern's colony and another colony. This place holds some significance to the story, but I won't spend more time here talking about it, since I want to save that for the comic. What I can spend more time talking about, however, is the process of it. Those who watched my behind the scenes video about the Lay All Your Love on Me map part may remember how I briefly mentioned back then about the Advanced Layers function in Adobe Animate. I finally got an excuse to try it out, and I was pleasantly surprised how much depth it created for the first shot. So, how does this tool work exactly? In Adobe Animate CC, you can add a camera layer that can zoom in, zoom out, or pan in any particular direction you want it to. Using this night shot as an example, I had the camera pan up to the sky as Fern lifted up her gaze to look at the stars. That's the basic function you can use the camera tool for. But what Advanced Layers does is that the layers will react to the movement of the camera depending on how they are placed in front of the camera. The way the layers react to the camera movement solely depends on how the camera moves. Using this night shot of Fern as an example, the layer at the front, which are the ferns, moves a lot faster downwards than the back layer, which has the tree silhouettes, that moves upwards. If the camera had instead moved in towards Fern, in that case, the ferns would have zoomed out of the screen much faster than the second layer after it, because it is the closest to the camera. So, technically, the closer an object is to a camera, the faster it moves or disappears. This is something that you can grasp a better sense of when you put your hands on it. But I hope my small explanation made still sense. However, because I began to experiment with this newest feature much later into the AMV process, I helped some of the layers with some manual tweening to fully hone in the movement and the way the camera seems to move above Fern. I have done this kind of editing with After Effects before, but doing this in Animate was definitely an experience. I hope to dive into it more later on. Backgrounds and animation finished, it's time to move into After Effects. After Effects is a program I genuinely didn't anticipate it becoming as useful for me as it has. I am so glad that through my current job, I have gotten to use it on a more daily basis and gotten much more comfortable with it. This also means that I can apply those skills to my own animations and potentially to future videos. Just like with the original character map part I did out of my yellow comic characters, I started off my After Effects process by sorting out the layers from the animate file that I had imported in as a composition. On top of sorting, I also pre-composed any layers or layer groups together just so that the main composition looked a lot cleaner and easier to follow. As an example, I usually pre-compose the layers that are part of a foreground, either of the active characters in the animation, background, or another significant element. After I had everything sorted out and color-coded, I began to do the actual editing. The main points with this AMV I want to run through are the blurry edge to give the animation a more dreamy effect, the beats during the running scene, and the floating lights that come in as Thistle's heartbeat is running away. Starting off with the easiest task, I went ahead and added an adjustment layer on top of everything. The adjustment layer appears as a transparent layer on top of everything, but it is super useful when you're applying effects that don't apply onto a single layer alone. In the case of giving the animation a blurry border, I made a shape layer, rectangle, on top of the adjustment layer. I applied the Gaussian blur effect onto the said shape layer in order to make the blurry border transform into the middle more seamlessly. As I had aligned the rectangle in the middle of the canvas on both X and Y axis and resized it to a size that I saw fit as an area that wouldn't be affected by the blur, I then went to the adjustment layer below and masked it to the shape layer above as alpha inverted matte. If I had used alpha matte, it would have blurred everything in the middle rather than the edges, which was the goal. Once I had the mask, I applied the Gaussian blur onto the adjustment layer and tada! There it blurs only the edges now, rather than the entire animation. That one is a very simple and fun effect to play around with. On to more complicated editing. The beats that I used on the running scene and the final shot where Thistle comes and boops Fern's nose with his, I achieved them with the CC Light Burst 2.5 effect I mentioned in my previous behind the scenes. This time I even have footage. The visual impact the CC Light Burst effect will be doing comes down to timing. The main features I edited were intensity and ray length. The former of the two controls how long or short the ray of your bursting light effect is. When ray length is 0, the entire effect misses its punch, so to speak. Intensity affects how glowy the CC Light Burst effect is. The more intense the intensity is, the more luminous the effect is. I created another adjustment layer that was going to affect the entire project with the CC Light Burst 2.5 effect. On the effect, I added keyframes to the points where I wanted the effect to burst and glow, and where I wanted it to have no effect in place. Since this effect was going to happen on beats, I created each of the beats with 3 keyframes. First and the final keyframes were on 0, but the middle keyframe had the effect in all its glory. This makes it so that the effect grows from 0 to 100 and comes back down to 0 again. When the effect is at this said 100, it is at its full element. You can see the numbers I am using on this boop scene at the left of the screen recording, where the effect stats are located in After Effects. Feel free to take those numbers and experiment further if you want to. And speaking of numbers, it's time to talk about final effect for this behind the scenes, and unfortunately, this is going to be very anticlimactic because I will just give you a screenshot of the effect settings while I explain how I got those glowing orbs to work. In my old mini AMV, I had done the glowy orbs manually in Adobe Flash and twinned them in order to get them to move. Instead of spending that time and energy on that, I knew that After Effects had an effect that was going to help me, and that's called CC Particle World. I made a black solid layer and put the CC Particle World effect to it. The reason why I didn't record my process with figuring out this effect is that first, I'm not the most familiar with it, and second, it would have been footage where I would continuously go back and forth within the effects panel doing very minor changes. While I bet that would have been entertaining to watch, I will save you all the pain and suffering I went through and instead just show my settings for these glowy orbs. Just like with the previous effect, feel free to take these settings and experiment with them further. This AMV took a year to do with breaks. However, if I were to estimate how much time this ended up taking in total, I would shade that somewhere between a month or 2 months. Here we have it, the process of Thistle Mini AMV, my heartbeat running away from start to finish. While this could have been much more involved than what it ended up being, I am really happy that I got to share with you all a detailed rundown how I go about with personal animation projects like these. I have some on my to-do list that I hope to finish in the near future, so keep your eye out for that. Animated music videos are something I would love to do more often, and I'm so happy that you all have enjoyed the mini AMV as much as you have. If you want to give it a rewatch, or even check the 2014 version, both of them will be at the end card. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Please, stay safe, wash your hands, and have a good day or night.